if you're going to do an initial beginning.
So it's a special meeting. So I guess I'll call the meeting to order at 5:31 on April 18th. The only thing on the agenda that I'm aware of is the special meeting to talk with the town attorney to clear up some questions that we had. And I think we're ask some questions as well. Am I missing anything?
No, it's pretty much it. We're just trying. We had some new members that came in, and
yep.
Might not be familiar with the whole hearing process.
Right.
So,
as I mentioned to you initially, Peter had been talking about having a special meeting to go over procedure because we were really struggling with Zoom. Before Zoom, when we would have a meeting, we would make changes in the meeting on the applications, they would initial, but once we transitioned to Zoom, we got a little confused with notice, what changes they could make, what changes needed to be noticed, and we had applicants coming back 2, 3, 4 times, and they were getting upset. And I think that Linda and Peter were taking a little bit of the brunt of it because we kept sending them away saying we can't accept your application the way that it's submitted. So Peter had suggested that perhaps we'd have a meeting with you to figure out what we can take on the fly, what we can't take on the fly. I don't know how important that is now that we're back to in person, but it was still an issue that we were dealing with, like how much.
Well, it's still mixed,
changes.
so
it's true, it is still mixed.
So it would still be.
So
now hybrid.
And historically, Rich, we would have a meeting with the public. No problem. All of the exhibits would be brought to the meeting, and were not necessarily submitted in advance. So we could look at. In many cases, you had a preliminary meeting, you saw all the stuff, and then they came back to the public hearing, and you went through everything again as if you hadn't heard it yet. But then we could make changes in some cases. We'd write things, make notes, etc. And we sort of lost that ability. So then someone would come to a meeting and they'd be sitting at their house and they'd have the exhibit, and we couldn't.
We didn't know if we could share screens, like we struggled with that.
Immediate, or you just
immediate?
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. No. This is the town attorney, Rich Cody.
Oh,
Bill Ferguson. I don't know. Sarah.
Nice to meet you all.
Ted Keesman, who's been in frequent attendance of our meetings lately. Sorry.
No, I don't mean
that's all right. He didn't even know who you were.
Exactly.
He works for
Zoom.
I'm here with Ray Barrow. I work with Ray and Eric.
He used to work for himself.
I used to.
Yeah, weren't you on Main Street?
I was on Main Street until about 2006 or 7. And then I moved to a carriage house behind my house. Carriage house around there.
You're still there though. You're not in the London office, right?
I'm mostly in New London.
Oh, you did.
I still work out of there for people. Did you bring your renovations to the historic district?
He's in Stonington.
He's in
Oh, okay. So a lot of boards and commissions were confused by the executive orders and pandemic. Fortunately, we're out of it. So it was very awkward trying to do things through screens. So I think every board and commission, whether it's zoning board of appeals or planning and zoning commission or council, sharing their frustrations, like how do we deal with this? How do we do it? And it was longer because we lost it. Decisions were kind of jumpy. I don't know too many appeals, but now you're back doing things in person, so you can really begin to recover and do things the way you used to do.
So I guess the question is the way that we used to do them okay? They would submit an application. We wouldn't see materials until, I guess we do now because they've changed their system. Now materials are up online. I think it's going to be that way going forward. So we do have materials in advance, but how much, at what point do you have to say it needs to come, you need to come back and bring us more information, or can we continue to do it like we used to do it and make changes throughout the course of the meeting?
People would write stuff on their application and initial change figures.
It's like they wouldn't have submitted pictures of the neighbor's house across the street and they had them on their computer, so they'd show us.
So they supplement the application.
Correct.
Or they make changes, structural changes, material changes.
A few of them were completely showing us stuff
on their phones.
on their, sharing screen.
Well, there's two things going on with that. It's very common for an administrative agency reviewing applications to see further information come to them, supplemental information. You sit there and say, you're lacking this, or we'd like to see that, or would you mind changing this or that, and they'll bring in plans. Happens all the time with site plans, applications, so I wouldn't be too troubled by any of that. If they're showing something to you on a handheld device, my concern as a lawyer is going to be, how do I show that you saw that when there's an appeal taken and I have to return the record? But in a lawsuit against a board like this, someone appealing the decision, it's what we call record appeal. It's not so your decision is retried by the judge. The judge sits sort of like an appellate tribunal and just reviews what you saw and decides whether or not, based upon the evidence in front of you, you reach a reasonable decision. Or can't substitute its judgment for you. So it's just going to search through the record to determine that there was enough evidence for you to reach this decision. And that you acted reasonably, impartially, and you gave due process. If I can't produce everything you saw, the court's going to say, well, you can't produce the record. I can't review it. I have to send it back.
So whatever they show us electronically, we request, and to my knowledge, they've never not complied to give us hard copies within several days.
Right, they should do
So
that.
it does make it into the record. It's just that during the course of the evening, we don't have the hard copy. We pass around the
From
phone.
my standpoint, that's perfectly fine. As long as it's in the record by the close of the public.
But by the
It's
close of the
not,
public
it's
hearing,
not.
that in that case, it would not be.
Okay, well, the problem with accepting evidence after the public hearing is that it's considered to be ex parte, which means outside the opportunity of the public to comment on and rebut and maybe cross-examine the witness. So whatever evidence you rely on in reaching a decision, from my standpoint, needs to be in the record and in front of you by the time the public hearing closes.
What if we continued the hearing to allow them to submit it, and then the next hearing date, just reopen it for that purpose of permitting that additional?
You wouldn't reopen it, you just continue the public hearing. You open it on, say, February 1. You have it again on March 1, keep it open until April 1. And then make sure.
So that means they have to come back.
Yeah,
Which is what we were trying.
We were trying to avoid
eliminate.
it from a ministerial or administrative standpoint, forcing these people to keep coming back.
Well, they may not have to physically come back. I mean,
No, but it holds up their work, which is what we were trying.
They were getting upset about.
Yeah, that's something I can't fix.
Okay. Well,
I
as
mean,
long
there
as we
was
know what
one
it is.
person who had to come back 3 or 4 times because they hadn't, I don't know, it was like,
Sometimes I'll commonly see somebody who keeps coming back, the commission keeps wanting more information, new plans. Eventually gets to the point where it's better to just withdraw and refile. So, from a procedural standpoint.
I mean, in a lot of those instances, its culpability is on the applicant, but I guess we sort of, even though they have failed to read the list of what you're supposed to bring to a hearing or whatever, apparently a lot of people can't read. You still kind of feel badly about, and of course, it also affects us too, because, you're trying to sort of move through some of this stuff and not have it, you again, you're back, you bring the picture this time, that kind of thing, but
Well,
I guess as
and-
you say, there's not much you can do about it, right?
that one person, we were actually questioning the whole process that, whether it was, what was happening, because he was claiming he submitted it. And so, but then we did track, and you guys looked through and they showed us, it wasn't in, because it made it look like the town staff was like falling on their sword on this stuff, and it wasn't the case. But during the meeting, because it was like the 3rd time it came and still stuff wasn't in it. It was like, oh my God, what are we?
But Rich, what about the issue of, now that you have these hybrid meetings and it's a public hearing, is it, and because what happens now is that if you come to a preliminary and then they say, okay, we've seen your information, you're gonna have to add this and this and this to your application. And then there's a deadline for when they have to get it pretty much a deadline for when they have to get it to the town officials so that they can scan it in or whatever and then publish it. Are we required to pre-publish all of the exhibits? We didn't used to do that.
Right. We had them on the day we got them.
I mean, can they be disclosed at the public hearing?
Well, is that what you announced to the public?
Well, we didn't initially. Initially, everything just came into the meeting and we saw it all there. But when we went to the Zoom, because they were now publishing the exhibits and everything, it made it more difficult for applicants. So in other words, it almost made it 4 to 6 or more weeks before you could actually get through the whole administrative process.
The executive orders required documents to be submitted to the public agency in advance, 48 hours in advance of the meeting, and upload. Otherwise, it couldn't be considered. It's a very difficult part of the order. Not all the agencies comply. People would still show documents, through the computer screen. We'd sit there and say, well, you got to send it to us and let's continue the hearing because you've already seen it. But at this point, you should be receiving documents in the ordinary way the way you used to. You can receive documents during a public hearing. If somebody's talking to you here in person or talking to you this way, it's going to be, you're going to be recording it. So I'm going to return the video to the court if there's an appeal taken. Much in the way we would transcribe what happens. There's a person here, but the videos maybe enough. So I would just continue back to continue with the process you had originally. As long as, but not if it's on somebody's phone sitting here. That's not going to do it. Right.
There is no hard copy.
It's as though, say for example, I'm an applicant and I have new plans. And it comes to the second day of the public hearing, I show them just to you, and the public can't see them. Okay, and somebody says I'd like to see them, and you say no. It's going to be a process violation. So so I've got to be able to tell the court this was what it was presented to. So if they're showing you something that can't be seen or can't be recorded somehow.
I don't recall looking at somebody's phone.
People have come, well, we never took the phone, but people have come and said, look, I got a picture of this right here. But we always said, well, that's not good enough. Or always on an iPad. But what you're saying though is, I mean, what happens now, well, we've only had one meeting prior to this, but now what happens is camera up here. And so the plans are laid out and you can see the plans on the screen. So that's considered to be,
That's better.
that's public disclosure because the video, Peter, the video actually gets saved.
Yeah.
So
You can watch it on YouTube.
So you have a record of it then.
But if they just show the phone,
That's not, well, that's probably not gonna.
Oh, you got to zoom in.
Yeah. Yeah.
Unless the person is, showing it on, everybody can see it on the screen. Then it doesn't matter. It's just that the information that you rely upon, I've got to be able to return and point to the purpose.
What if they texted the picture or whatever they had on their phone to the staff and the staff put it on?
That would be fine.
but you can't do it after the record's closed. You
No,
have to
during
keep
it,
the record.
during the meeting, they could do it.
During the hearing.
Yeah.
And staff knows that if something something's submitted, during after the public hearing, not to get.
But now that the entire presentation is recorded, everything that they show is videotaped. I guess that's not something that we really need to worry about that much anymore.
It may not be.
Okay.
I have another question for you. We've had a gal that was come 3 times at least because there was a decision made about a fence, and what it could have been anything, but this particular one was about a fence. And after the fact, what is her process if she's really unhappy with whatever was passed and something was put up for our approval?
Was she the applicant or?
She was a neighbor.
So she was objecting to the application and granted the application.
And she didn't know about it, so she wasn't at.
She objected
She
after
never
the fact.
objected to the application.
She didn't know.
Well, she didn't object during the meeting.
No,
Yeah, she wasn't at the meeting.
after the decision. She
She objected to the decision. Did she file an appeal?
No.
I don't remember that.
She doesn't know what the process is. She's contacted me, or she's contacted any of you
She's
guys.
common. We
She should
we
consult
had
the
the
lawyer.
staff.
She is an
go-
attorney.
The issue was what it was represented, what we were going to be able to see of the fence. And what in fact, once the work was done, what she could see of the fence from her yard. So she's, and the record, I guess, is unclear as best we can determine in terms of.
Well, and her argument with her lawyer hat on is if you read the CO, it says cannot be visible from the public way or something along those lines, and it is. So she feels to see the, where we granted as a.
So is it a question of that? What she's claiming is that the decision, is she complaining about the decision or is she complaining about a condition on the decision as being?
She's complaining about two things. One, she's saying that the applicant didn't comply with what we ordered and approved, which is also questioning what we approved. So,
Well, if she's questioning the decision, she has 15 days to file. So that becomes a final decision. So after that, it's the question of enforcement of the decision, what's set. So if there's a specific violation of the decision, we can work with that.
And Tom went out and determined it wasn't a violation.
Yeah, but she says he was at the wrong address. So she sent me a super long email on this.
Yeah,
Laying
well,
it all out.
that's an enforcement issue.
Which is what we told her in the last meeting, was if she thought that the CEO made a mistake, to delineate exactly what she's trying to say and go back to him and say, this is why I think that it was wrong. So
Well,
I don't know what came of
To
it.
take it away from that specific case, it could be any case where somebody comes and presents to us and doesn't really give us all the pictures. So what we're looking at might not have included that view. And so the decision might have been made without all the info.
And that's the crux of her argument, that the applicant did not give us all the info and all the
Yeah,
pictures.
but that's our responsibility as a board to ask for more information. Otherwise, you guys sit there forever. It's all eternity. and claim, I didn't get the view from 271 degrees from X street. You could drag that forever.
Once the decision is made, appeal period is off. It's final. After that, you're talking about enforcement discretion, which is entirely different thing. When you have a decision, the question is it being violated? And you're not required to enforce it. Exercise your discretion, say, yeah, there's a violation, but we just don't have the resources. We can say we will. That's what the enforcement officer does, decide whether or not to enforce. The attorneys wouldn't get involved until the enforcement has commenced, and an order's been issued, or it's been requested, seek a injunction, so some kind of relief.
So, and because that's another issue, isn't that an issue with the
Right.
bank?
Yeah.
The brewery. The whole issue of enforcement. I mean, in order for enforcement to occur, if somebody's done something, we don't think they did what we told them to do. And so the first step, I guess we take is we go to the zoning enforcement officer and ask the zoning enforcement officer to go look at what was done and then make a decision as to whether or not what was done complies with the approval by the Historic District Commission. If the zoning enforcement officer, as in the case of the fence, decides that there isn't an issue, and the complainant, which might be the Historic District Commission, or it might be a neighbor, then what happens?
Well, the neighbor is petitioning the zoning enforcement officer on a claim of a violation of your decision. The zoning enforcement officer will decide whether to enforce it or not. And the officer acts as your agent, so it's acting on your behalf.
So I'll take that 30,000 foot view. What do we do? Like the house off a couple off of Elm Street has the shutters on it that shouldn't be up there. I mean, if somebody doesn't even come to the Historic District Commission and does work, we just decide, can we even handle the violation, or I mean,
Well, it would be a violation of the regulations if you conducting work without a CO.
Yeah, but respectfully to, I mean, I don't know how many things have been brought to his attention to review. The fence on Pearl Street, I mean, it's been a pretty long list and nothing on anything, with the exception of Sunny's deck that would be built up.
Well, there was that time with that house that had the fence on Route 1. And it ended up being on state property. So, and then they did something about that.
Tom actually does
Tom
do a
did.
pretty thorough job when he's going through it all. It's just, I think you don't like some of the decisions he comes up with.
No, you got the fence on Pearl Street that was brought up a year and a half.
He actually has been working with them.
I mean, I don't mean to sound weird, but
That's one example. Yeah.
if there's no enforcement, just sends a message to the residents of why don't come see us, right? If it take a year and a half or we don't do anything, then kind of what's the point?
I mean, you've got the house, you have the house on Library Street next to this guy who's been here a million times, which just has to go. The one that's been under construction for 1 year, so whatever, that their certificate of this is long run out. And not even about that. That's the other.
He's got an active building permit and he keeps coming in for an inspection within that 180-day window to make sure he's always on, keeping his permit.
That doesn't keep the certificate.
That's a good question, actually. So he's had an extended building permit out forever that he's got an approval, and it's gone past the time frame of what you would have approval for a historic district to comply with.
I'd have to look at the decision.
How long ago did we approve that house? Wasn't all, it could have been
It was
5 years
probably
ago, but
over
probably not a
5
whole
years
lot
ago.
more than that.
Which
He's been
house?
slowly building. That one with the cement wall, the one that had the fire. He's been
He's doing it.
very slowly building it, but he's always been making inch-worth progress.
It's hard for me to talk about specific cases without seeing, and it's probably better to say general. It's somebody.
The general question though is if the certificate of permit is for 5 years and someone doesn't complete the work in 5 years, what happens?
But there's still.
I've got to look at the decision. I just got to take a look at it. I mean, it would seem natural that it would expire. And that's sort of, I want to see what the actual certificate of permit says.
It'd be interesting to get approval, started the project, then denied him.
I don't think it's necessarily about the now. I just think it's about continuous commentary from the residents and the public that
Your regulations talk about substantial movement on the work under permit.
I'm not sure.
No, I don't think so.
which gets to a further question, which is, do we even have any regulations? Because we've had this fight internally over, is the HTC guidebook even already? What is it?
What have you adopted?
So from my understanding, we have guidelines that were written in the 90s, which they're at our discretion to revise, and that, I've met with the town planner in working on getting someone to be able to rewrite them, or that's where we left it off last. We met before COVID and then it kind of fell off. And then I sent him an email a short time ago, but those are guidelines. Those aren't regulations. They've never been, from my understanding. Regulations were guided by the statute, from my understanding.
Well, regardless of what you call guidelines or regulations, the question is, are they criteria by which you measure an application?
They're suggestive.
Which is tough because many people come, like the lady with the fence, come to the table and say, hey, your guidelines say no chain link fences within a public view. And we say, well, we approve.
I don't know what the background is as to why you wouldn't have, set of standards or guidelines or regulations. I mean, for an administrative agency to act legally, the judge has to be able to measure the facts in the application before you and whether or not they comply with the regulations and reach a reasonable decision. Because if you don't have regulations, it would be an arbitrary decision. So,
Subjective material.
so it may be that,
But then it becomes a fully subjective.
I mean, I'm
course,
sort of
which is
getting the impression,
allowed.
well, it would be arbitrary, not just subjective. Right? In legal terms, which is be arbitrary, it would be reversed. Told to adopt regulations, but I wasn't aware of that, so it may be you want to, sit down and take a look at what you're using and go through the process of adopting.
Because you have dozens, if not more, comments online and in that letter that I got. I think
We all got it.
Yeah,
And
stating
and
that.
you want to have standards so that people who are applying for it understand what they've got to do. People who are investing in the community understand what
What's the standard or the process for municipal agencies to adopt regulations?
for a public notice. Much in the way you can treat an application. with a public.
I think the question on these is, were they adopted?
I would assume something was adopted. There's a vote somewhere in the minutes, but we'd have to do some research. I don't. But you've been applying this set of guidelines, right?
Really. They're quite rigorous. The new materials that have come out, are much better
Maybe
to
Kevin
use
Quinn
than
would
when
know.
the materials that are being used now weren't even in existence when those guidelines were written. So it doesn't address a lot of what comes before us.
You think Kevin would know? Quinn?
It's just what's in the end.
Yeah.
Rich, is there
But I
anywhere
mean,
we
he
can
might
pull
know
minutes
if
from 30
it's
years ago,
adopted.
probably adopted in the mid
Maybe
90s?
it's town clerk's office. You probably want to go back to when the.
It was adopted July 1994.
It had to be adopted.
So something was adopted. Now, if there's updated standards, you want to adopt those.
I guess I'm not as concerned with the use of the materials, because I think that's just a natural progression, of like building standards. For me, it's more about, what's in there relative to like preservation, lack of demolition, if there's alternatives, and some of the larger things that specifically we've changed our related to that gravel strip mess. I think, saying that now we can use PVCs and borals and things like that, I think everyone's okay with that. That's life.
I guess my point is that it's not in there. So if that's the direction that we do, which, your question was, do you apply them? My question is not really, because so many things have changed from when it was written in 1994. So perhaps getting back with the town planner and making it a priority to have those reviewed by someone. He was looking at a grant and someone who writes guidelines to revise them might be something that we might get a little faster than we were.
Because we can't, it's just a regular meeting, just say, here's our new standard, and take a vote and say, that's it, and it's in the minutes, this is our standard. And so going
You've
forward.
got to,
public
go through a
hearing.
process. Yeah.
But until we update them, if that's been adopted, that's our guide or no?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, but it's, you're going into a real hornet's nest here when you start talking about architectural standards and design criteria. I mean, the guidelines specifically provide for a construction of a contemporary building in the historic district. But there's no guideline that says, well, what does that mean? You're gonna tell me what the pitch of my roof has to be? You're gonna tell me what kind, in other words, you cannot define with any certainty all of these various guidelines or rules or whatever. The old Historic District Commission that preceded us, I appeared for them a number of times and they'd say, oh, well, wait a minute. You don't have a roof over that deck there? That you got it cut out for the deck? And I go, yes. They said, oh, well, no, we don't like that. It's not based on it. It's not based on anything in particular. There are buildings of all different kinds of architectural characters. So I don't know what the answer is in terms of what I'm saying. But if you think that you can have someone sit down and specifically lay out exactly what you can or can't do, you're not going to get there. And we are not supposed to be, and I've said this before at the meetings, we're not supposed to be preservationists per se. How can you allow a contemporary structure in a historic district and still say you have to preserve everything? In other words, I don't know what the answer is, but it's not simple. And I've been to other historic district commission meetings in Charleston, for example. And they have some very strict requirements, sometimes with regard to older buildings, and then very loose requirements with regard to when someone's making a major change or is building a new building. In other words, it's not, you don't have to make it look like an old building. So I don't know exactly what the answer is, but it's not as simple as just sitting down and scrivening away and coming up with a bunch of standards. I don't think.
But I think some standards are better than none. We have to have some standards.
Yeah, and that's how laws are evolved.
Right.
A zoning, a set of zoning rules evolved from someone creating that, and that's what they interpret, that's what they follow. I mean, do they deviate from it, you know, make subjective choices? Sure, but the reality is, we still need a core handbook that we're supposed to follow and enforce, something to at least give us some direction.
And so for the public to know what we're basing it off of too. I mean, it's got to go both ways, I think.
Right.
I mean, regulations can be somewhat general. They don't have to be specific as to, like, say, construction material. But they've got to be reasonable, be written in such a way that somebody who's coming in and filing an application has a reasonable idea of what's to be expected. How the application will be approved. Courts are okay with some general criteria, but I would, you know, in order for me to help you, I need to see a specific instance. Again, for me to, I'm looking at it from the standpoint of defending the decision you made. And I just want to be sure that the reason you denied it was supported by the regulation and the evidence. So if you were to deny something because it's PVC, and the regulations say it shall be it's sort of requires general material, you may not win the case. But if it says it shall be wood, cedar, or and then you deny it because it is PVC, and you say, well, you just have the regulations, so maybe you should bring up. So that's the way the law looks at it. Now, if the regulations are fairly general, you know, it's hard to tell you what's too general, but you know, you'll be given some latitude with respect to each application, as long as you apply it consistently. Historic commissions statewide, there's a lot of rub with historic commission. A lot of people complain that they seem to be arbitrary. So what you're being accused of is, you know, if I'm reading this right, is something most historic commissions get accused of.
We figured that. And you know, as I said, some of it is a function of sitting on the commission. It's like, I mean, you can talk about clarity and stuff. You go to the Supreme Court, the decision is rendered in large measure as a function of who the individuals are who sit on the court, and not necessarily, in my opinion, the strict interpretation of the law. It's how do I see it, right? Right? You what?
I hope not.
Well, you know what I'm saying is true.
Well,
So you can, you know, I'm in practice law for a long time, but I mean, let's face it, the decisions you get today are not the same as the decisions you would have gotten 10 years ago. And that's because reasonable people can differ on things. And so what's reasonable to one is not to another. And depending on what my agenda is, which shouldn't be an issue, but is, it's not.
Well, I always say, if you have a lawyer who tells you you're going to win or lose, run for your life.
Yeah, right, you're right. And if you think you're going to get justice when you bring a lawsuit, you're not going to get justice. You get a result, but you may not get justice. So
it may be rough justice.
Yeah,
it's something.
Well, but Todd, you're getting back. I think it's why having standards are all more important. I think it makes it less arbitrary if we get out of this.
I just don't think it's
Generally
fair.
speaking, the courts will follow, the superior courts, trial courts will follow the standards.
But forget protecting us. I just don't think it's fair to the public, because you've got a set of guidelines that's written online that they refer to. And then they come in here and either something's approved that some people believe shouldn't be approved, or something's denied that shouldn't necessarily be denied. It just turns into this, why read the guidelines? You know, like I keep going back to this lady at the fence. Like, it says no chain link fences. She's like, it says no chain link fences. Why do we have a chain link fence in my backyard? It's a good question.
And it's visible from the public view, which says shouldn't be.
But we believed at the time that it wasn't.
Right.
From the pictures you showed.
Right. We could be able to come back with another picture. She just didn't take the right pictures of the right things.
Keep in mind too, that if you're going to enforce your regulations, there are violations everywhere. You know, like the zone, it's hundreds of violations everywhere. The attorneys don't want to pick a clear case if there's going to be a message sent. And some judges aren't interested in little cases. So, usually, judge likes to see a clear violation. Not if it tax the court's use.
But didn't they drag Desmarais all the way? Didn't that go all the way?
No, they lost a superior point.
They lost.
Yeah, Desmarais lost. Generally, the court finds for the administrative board, unless there's something.
80 to 90%.
What case are you
What,
talking about?
80 to 90%?
They went all the way to the court.
It's very difficult to overturn an administrative decision as long as there's no procedural defect.
So going back to this fence question, which I know you're not familiar with, but since we've been tossing this question around, let's not use that case as an example, but let's use an example if someone does bring an application before us and generally outright lies, completely misrepresents their application. And I know you said that it's on us to gather more information, but we did gather more information with her. We did make her come back 2 more times, in fact, I think she was before us 3 times because we didn't really like that chain link fence. She had a valid reason for it. I forgot what it was, maybe a dog or something along those lines. And you know, she testified that that fence was not visible from a public way, if I recollect correctly, but in fact it was.
And I think we went so far as to say would be approved if it wasn't visible.
Right.
Which is, I think, was the point.
Which is what the certificate actually says, if you read it.
So if you are beyond the appeal period, okay, because I understand after 15 days it becomes final. If someone misrepresented and it's clear, not vague, is there any recourse on that?
Well, I mean, there's 2 things going on at the same time. One, you can enforce, you know, make sure when in your decisions you're carefully writing your decisions to make that a condition that it shall not be visible. Then I've got something in the court. The law on rescinding permits or reopening them because of misrepresentation is still developing. It's not clear. Of course, usually want to see something in regulations that say you have the opportunity to do that if there is a intentional misrepresentation. The remedy, I guess, would be revocation. So you have to reopen the permit and revoke the permit. You have to adopt the new regulations and standards that would govern decision making for why you revoke it here and not revoke.
So you'd have to have regulations that permitted a revocation in the event of what, fraud?
That's the way
Misrepresentation.
that's the way the law is developing. It's not clear that the historic commission under the existing statutory scheme is authorized to revoke permits. I'd have to look at that basic fundamental question.
I mean, fortunately.
So the thing to do, the real trick here is to just write your certificates of appropriateness and decisions clearly. So like in that case where they've made a representation that's not going to be visible, don't assume it. Just say it shall not be visible when constructed. Then you can enforce, I can enforce the condition.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Did ours say that?
I know, I would have to go look. I know that we discussed it. I know that it's in the minutes, but I don't know if that's actually what's on the approval because the way that our approvals are generally done is Linda writes them and sends them for us to sign. We don't typically write them.
So this homeowner sent me a copy. I think it says that the picket fence has to cover it if it's visible from any public way. That was the condition we gave them.
But hers, the case, it's not picket, it's the stone wall.
Right, but we said the wood fence has to cover the chain link wherever it's visible. That's the way that the certificate's written.
If that's in fact true, then Tom should be taking care of that. And that's where she needed to contact Tom with that letter and the documentation.
Yeah, which is where I left the last meeting. I told them I expect to be getting an email from her with specific things to look at.
Okay.
And I haven't followed up with them, so that's coming up.
Unfortunately, in all the years I've been on this board, this is the only one time that I feel like I had someone misrepresent something or along those lines, or it appears that way. I'd have to go back to look at the notes, but I'm sensing that she was misrepresenting what's going on. It doesn't happen very often. But.
And I just wanted to weigh in if I could. This is Linda behind the scenes. And always previous. So I'm listening in. And previous to COVID and having Zoom meetings, the board always filled out the COAs and listed any stipulations if there were any. And then when we were really shut down and just, trying to get through so that people could get things and apply for building permits and move forward with their building, I would just number it and, mark off as submitted if that was the case. If I had any additional information that required, what's the word I'm looking for? A stipulation, I would indicate it, but, I think, we've discussed this, Peter and I, that, COVID was difficult for all of us. We had to adjust and do the best that we could. But going forward, my sense and my expectation is that you're going to be, filling out the COAs, putting down stipulations, et cetera, et cetera. So I just wanted to weigh in on that one.
Passing the buck.
I don't.
Back to us.
I don't know where it was.
No, not passing the buck so much as I have only so much expertise.
No.
I don't think though that neighbor, the applicant, misrepresented. I think that they came in, they told a story. We approved it in a way that we thought we were approving it. And then, quite frankly, like their fence contractor dropped the stuff off. It sat in the driveway to around the corner for like 4 months. And then he came back and he did it. I don't think he even knew what he was doing. I think he just did it. So I don't think that was so much a misrepresentation. I think if anything was a misrepresentation, it would be the guy in Gravel Street coming in and saying the house was falling down when it wasn't. That was a misrepresentation. I think Tom just needs to look into watch the minutes or whatever the approval was and go back and say like no, like or yes or no, like you guys approved this and it's on the COA and it's not this. Change it.
He didn't say the house was falling down.
He did. He 100% did.
No, he didn't.
No,
Yeah,
he
he
did
did.
not.
So we only have so much of Rich's
100%.
time.
Yeah, he did.
So
Can I ask 2 general
Please.
questions?
yes.
This is just for my education. Everyone else probably knows the answer, but I want to hear it. What's the definition of a conflict of interest?
Conflict of interest?
Yeah.
Well, there are statutes and there's common law. Generally speaking, it's what they call personal or financial interest. It's easy to determine a financial interest. You look to see whether the person's, got an investment in either the application, the property of the application involves, or somebody who's with the zone of the treatment who has an interest in the property. It might be affected financially by the decision making. Personal interests, courts usually try to define those again in terms of financial interest, unless it's something unusual and something that just a bias they don't like face, somebody's face, or there's racial discrimination. So it's case by case, generally speaking. But for example, the first case in Connecticut came out of the 40s where the applicant was married to the chairman of the board, and that was a conflict of interest actually for the chairman to vote on. So that's easy. Somebody who lives across the street from an application probably has a conflict of interest in financial interest.
Can I ask a question on top of that, though? So Mystic, where we have Stonington and Groton as jurisdiction, so, I mean, silly example, say I own a restaurant in Stonington and he owns a restaurant in Groton, both in Mystic, but I deny his application. Would that be a conflict of interest, even though we're in two separate?
No, I mean, your interest would probably be as general as anybody else. Maybe a little bit more specific, but not enough to achieve financial.
Even if we're like right across the bridge, I tried to put his restaurant out of business and I'm on the
Oh,
Historic
well,
District
I
Commission.
mean, if it's if you're fighting over restaurants, it's in competition, right?
But that's tough, though, because I think we all have interest in downtown in one form or another.
Well, it depends whether it's a financial interest.
We all have financial interest. We either have clients, we own property.
Not all of us.
It'll have to be a case by case.
I have no interest in anything down
You
there.
know, I mean, if somebody's living on one side of gravel street and someone's living on the other end, both on gravel street. I think anybody's got a financial interest in.
But the brewery, so I own commercial space on the water. Should I ever use myself on anything involving the brewery? Because
Is that like right across the street?
Essentially 200 feet away.
Probably.
So that anything on Main Street downtown,
I wouldn't say anything, whether, you know, sometimes, if I remember the situation, I think I looked at that. It was, did you already voice objections to something?
It was the pictures you sent to the board.
In other words, you took a position in advance.
Right.
And so
no, post decision, but pre us asking for enforcement.
Yeah, so that's where it focused it in my mind. But again, it's going to have to be case by case, and it's tough because we are a small community.
And that gets into the whole, what is an actual meeting when there's a consensus between members that start doing email chains with each other.
You know, that's a thorny issue under the Freedom of Information Act. This one totally different.
That's actually my second question. Todd, Eric, and I are out for beer. Okay. And Sarah. Okay.
Why not me? I'm joking.
I'm just trying to be like not picking on anybody. It's just 3 people, 4 people. We're out for a beer. Our kids are all the same, as a hypothetical. Our kids are all the same. They just finished their softball game. We're like, they went home to eat mac and cheese, and we're like, we need to have adult time. We've been around 14-year-old girls all day, so we went out for a beer.
Specific.
It is specific.
See, other ones.
Sarah's here, and I'm scared. So during our second beer, we're like, can you believe that chain link fence? Again, hypothetical. Is that in violation?
A meeting under the Freedom of Information Act that is required to be noticed, minutes kept, and held in public, open to public, is defined to be a gathering of forum or more multi-member. So if there's 3 of you together anywhere, and you're discussing business, it's going to be, therefore, the Freedom of Information Commission will decide it's a meeting that should have been held properly. So it would be an illegal meeting. But the same would go forward if you were emailing and you're discussing business, something other than like the agenda. And you sort of reach a consensus by email. You say, yeah, I think that's a good idea, and everybody chimes in. I used to do it all the time when chairman of the commission in Stonington. I'm constantly cautioning my members against that.
We could talk about a time for a meeting, but we can't talk about specifics on a case.
But it's difficult. It's hard because you tend to begin to the decision-making process, which is supposed to be open to the public, is being hidden from the public via email. So you walk in with a preconceived mind, and that's what the public's supposed to be able to get to. So to the extent you can minimize that, better.
And so if we talk about a case that's already closed, is that in violation?
Well, if you talk about a case that's already closed, like this fence issue, you're now talking about enforcement.
But even if
what do we do about this? How do we fix it under our regulations?
but so, okay, but if we're not talking about enforcement on like,
But then what was, just on the enforcement thing, what was wrong with the email chain related to the brewery? Because it was after the fact of the decision saying they didn't comply. Here's the photos. They didn't comply. It wasn't about the making a decision. It was about the, you didn't do what you're supposed to do.
I'm not following, I'm sorry.
Well, you were getting at the point of the difference between the difference between having a meeting where we're going to come to a determination or sway a determination that's upcoming versus the determination or the being made on the application, and then after the fact having a conversation about they didn't comply.
Well, by email or in person?
Email
Well,
or in person.
or in person. Well, if it's in person and it's three or more people on a 5-member agency, it's going to be a meeting.
Even if you're talking about a post approval.
even after it's
enforcement.
closed.
Right, because you still have jurisdiction to enforce that permit.
Which is what the whole email was intending to do.
But
I
then
mean, in other words, this was an email that said, I think this is in violation of your circular.
Correct.
Okay, well, if you just push the email out, I don't think you're having a meeting, you're just letting people know, letting everybody on the board know that this is going to be discussed at the next meeting. Much in the way staff may hand you a package of material for the upcoming meeting. But if you begin to exchange ideas about it, the FYC will see it differently.
That's what I
We'll see
spoke
this-
of when you guys were discussing it. You start having a
Right.
discussion.
Yeah.
But that was my point to you though, which is that for the freedom of information commission to take an action, you have to get that far. I don't think in that specific instance we ever got there. I think that the email chain could have easily just been added to the record. I mean, it's all about the disclosure of the actual.
What I can tell you about the Freedom of Information Commission, is that fighting with them on for municipalities since the late 80s, is that they can make a finding of a violation, they will. They're all about public disclosure, all about making sure decision-making is done in public. So if it's this gray area, you've got to assume the Freedom of Information Commission will rule against it.
You'd be weakening your case at that point by doing it.
And that's embarrassing.
You can be fined.
Very rare, but yes, it's true. But mostly what happens is the public loses trust.
I was on a state board, and had to pay $25 for that.
I guess another question is getting to like enforcement of things. How restrictive an interpretation or who decides on how strict the interpretation is on the violation? Because we've battled internally back and forth relative to the fence after the agreement. With Tom saying it's not a violation, us saying maybe it is, some people not agreeing,
Well, it depends upon what's, I didn't look at the permit in that particular circumstance. I don't know what it said. In terms of how specific it is, if it's a violation, and it's unenforcement, the enforcement officer thinks it is. It's like supported by the evidence, supported by the decision. Probably be valid enforcement.
This one was actually a little bit of a tricky one because the fence that was put up, not using the word constructed, the fence that was put up was the appropriate size and matched what was presented to us at hearing. We, in our mind, saw a well-constructed wrought iron fence. It was somehow grounded to the earth. What was put there was sections of like Home Depot fencing that matched the pictures. So what Tom was saying was that the fence complies with the application. And what I was arguing was that we have jurisdiction over fixed structures, not movable objects. If it's movable, we don't have jurisdiction over it. And we approved a fence, meaning that it had to be a fixed structure. And he was saying that I was incorrect in my interpretation, and we didn't get very far.
But also the civils had it at 3 feet. That was the thing that I sent you.
Yes, and
It's not.
but it was only off by a little, and he cited something by saying, you know, it was off by a margin. It was satisfactory.
Except to contain.
That's not our jurisdiction.
Right.
So we didn't get very far on whether it actually wasn't conforming or not conforming.
But, well, again, it's from my standards, it's gonna come down to what you said.
No, they
Said
really
shall
say-
be made of this material, shall be fixed and immovable. But if it's left general, you have to prove the violation. And you can't prove it easily.
Well, I guess I was arguing the fact that he presented a fence to us, I mean, it had to be a fixed structure. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to approve it because it would be movable. That argument wasn't holding much water.
Not rich for. I mean, what's movable?
Certainly this fence. What were you gonna say?
No, I was just saying that, yeah, definitely not immovable. Just one other question though.
How does it
If-
stick on the ground?
If the zoning enforcement officer decides that there is a violation, then what is, and cites the person, the individual, whatever, then what happens?
If it's not in compliance, if the recipient of the respondent we call doesn't comply, they come in or, come to us and we can force it. It seeks judicial remedy, which would be, a judgment, an injunction. And contempt, that was compliant.
Maybe I misheard, but there was a time where we enforced against, again, in the case of the brewery, we said you were out of compliance in this case, and he had 90 days, like basically to get through the summer. To
So
comply, right? Am I totally?
Tom and P and Z collectively perhaps sent a letter and he got bonded. So he had so much time to comply.
It sounded like he could get through the summer.
Well, it's weird though, because the historic district commission, you have 5 years to complete the certificate of appropriateness. P and Z, you have to complete everything to receive a CO unless you bond out of
They do have stipulations where they can,
Right.
they have some leeway with that. The stipulations,
plans,
so
things
bond
like
it or
that,
whatever.
but you can't bond out of like a stairwell.
It's emergency.
So he could get the CO, get the approval from P and Z, and still never complete our stuff, potentially for 5 years.
That was what was confusing.
Well, the bank case was weird because they gave him approval, I think, for something.
We give
Ahead
conditional
of
approval
time.
with stipulations that they bonded out, that he
Right.
bonded for.
Which just makes it tough to enforce anything. Historic, because I'll do it in 5 years.
Well, anyone can do that. Anyone can do it.
No, I'm just saying it makes it tough because you can't hold the CO over someone's head. It's like,
You don't get.
And it goes with the pendulum swing of which way are we going? Are we going to support development and growth? Or are we going to be restrictive and try to make sure everything's done precise? And it always swings back and forth. So within a 10-year period, it swings both ways.
it's also hard to, as someone who builds, like, not everything works, so you have to make changes, things like that. I just think what's a reasonable change?
Anyone have any other questions for Rich?
Can I ask?
Please, sure.
Two of the general precepts in the guidelines, I'd like if you can just amplify a little bit of color around them if you guys fix them up. One is not visible. Everything's visible. I think Eric pointed out one time. You get a pair of binoculars or something, or the building comes down, you can see all the buildings. So I'm curious about what would be sort of a vague enough, reasonable enough definition of what's visible from a public way.
But yeah, there comes in, sometimes we have mini splits on the back. houses, then it's like you're driving up from this road and you'll catch it, and I've had a couple come in here, like, no, that's not visible, you don't take a permit for it. I'm like, well, technically it is visible if you, for a brief second.
Well, that's the
I
point.
mean, some of the 7 foot can see something, somebody who's 5 foot can't. It's it may not be easy, and may
It's a
may-
great
may
thing.
cause
I did it
difficulty
somehow.
in some cases. You're usually talking about screening. But removing visibility, so tonight you want to use reasonable, reasonably not visible. So that, so that the person having a permit doesn't have to worry about that kind of a problem.
Right.
That's because, you can see it from Google, you can see it from satellites.
Yeah, no,
I mean, that's gonna be
it-
gray.
it
That's
plays
gonna be
into
gray no matter what.
The fencing, one of the fences we
So,
discussed a little bit.
What usually you do is you take a look at the application and say, okay, well, we're gonna require screening here and here to achieve the level of non-visibility. Instead of just saying it can't be visible, you regulate it differently.
The other one that shows up a lot is like for like doesn't require. It's just because of appropriateness. But now, since 1994, it's almost impossible to do a like for like, technically. Right? Something's going to be different in the. So is there another, it's the same as the other question in the sense, how do you make that a little bit looser without losing, so it's still reasonable for the applicant that they can replace and repair things. I've seen a lot of sheds repaired that, well, I don't know, I know we're not talking about specific examples, but sometimes in this, I think your rewriting of standards is in the future because of what Rich has already said. Some of those I think are a little tricky to write in a way that shows common sense, reasonableness. And,
they're all tricky.
right. So I think the hardest job you guys have, by the way, is judgment, because not any of this is going to be black and white, which makes it hard for the lawyers. You're always going to say, how much of the chain link fence did you see? Because I think at the time you deliberated on chain link fence, it says in the guidelines no chain link fence unless you can't see it.
As long as you're acting reasonably and consistently, the decision is going to be usually as long as there's no procedural issue. So you're given deference to the exercise of your discretion. And you consistently are interpreting and applying a regulation a certain way, and stay true to that. And the court's going to give that deference. They'll even defer to your interpretation of the regulation if it's applied consistent, unless it's clearly.
So I brought that up for you guys to clarify on that exactly. People that are doing work with the window in the back and you see it like for 1 second. I don't know if you want to have that here or not.
Well, it's supposed to be from any public, isn't it? Say from any public street.
Right, but his point though, like if you're going down Noack Road and you look up on an angle for 1 second, you can see the back of my house, but you can't see from anywhere else, except that the trees are gone in the middle of winter.
Right.
So the point is, do we really want to see those applications flood in here when they're not necessarily necessary?
I think the other issue is that we just accept the applicant's representation of that facts.
Right.
We don't question them, they go out and do some business, send the staff out.
Well, but maybe that's the fix, then maybe we change a regulation where they have to notice the neighbors, so the neighbors who are directly affected can come in.
I think it's also possible in this too, like using that example. If I took my
Then
windows
they have
out
to
down and
notice.
place in the morning, that's the tricky part. If I put a giant pink awning off the back of my house, like,
Right.
maybe not.
Pink awning, no. Windows.
Yeah.
But I think that's the point, is when we put stuff in the decision where we codify what they represented, and then if what they represented is true, we have a much cleaner shot at enforcing it. If we just accept their word and then don't really put it in writing in the decisions.
If not, you guys go live again, and you'd be right, and then it's might be a little bit more detailed in it.
Yeah, hopefully a lot of these issues will go away. Does anyone have any other questions for Rich?
The last one's about climate change stuff, like solar panels and heat pumps. You guys are improving all those, and I think they're good for the sustainable environment position. And they're clearly not historic, and they're not in the guidelines.
Actually
There's a state
encouraged in the statute.
There's a state statute.
Yeah, I know. Again, if you're talking about making it transparent to the guy that's coming to the thing, he's reading this going, gosh, I don't know. No, I mean, I would never went to the statutes to see what you're gonna say. I was just reading the handbook.
We do comment on the location of like the ancillary equipment, but as far as like the solar panels, like they come in with these complex presentations that you gotta be an engineer to follow. Like, I don't care what the solar panels made out of, it's a solar panel. But if they're gonna put the big transfer switch like dead on the front of the house covering the 1880 sign, like probably not a great place.
I think it's nice you're encouraging. I think that's a good thing, but they can be put in a way that's not, that's more consistent with the characteristic of the neighborhood, I guess. So it just opens up another avenue to address in the handbook and shows how it's out of date in some ways.
Well, there's like the shed dormer stuff. I mean, the original HTC never would have put shed dormers, but like shed dormers work in a lot of homes. Like,
Pardon me?
Shed dormers work, right?
Oh,
People aren't 5'2" anymore. Like you need ever, that's what works. And it's now been generally accepted. Whereas that guidebook says, under no circumstances, shed dormer.
I have one more question. I know you want to let everyone go, but in Zoom, I got to see like tomorrow's meeting. I can see all the stuff, and it's pretty cool to review it all ahead of time and digest and think about it, even walk around the site if you'd like. And so if you go back to the old days, you won't see anything other than notice in the paper or on the agenda that's published on the website. And if it just says Windows, and it's pretty, or a sign like for the new port of call, just says sign. I think the sign looks, I shouldn't use a real example. The sign I think looks cool. I think you'll like it, but oops, I shouldn't say stuff like that. That's pretty, no,
So
but this is a
you're
public
saying
meeting.
this-
So I can
this-
say
can have a sound
You're
like this,
saying that
okay.
because you got the meeting link ahead of time, you could look at all
Yeah,
the
so I looked at theirs,
presentations. Why
so-
can't we include that still?
Well, I don't know if you have to go to that detail. I guess I was suggesting, but more detail. I don't know what level of detail is another hard question, but just protocol, new signage is way different than giving them a little more indication about what is coming.
So I know that Linda and Tom try with the applicants. Not everybody listens. They encourage, they give them the list, this is what you should do, they coach. But you still get signed. So.
Well, the applicants tend to think, they just think if they tell you it's good. I don't think they realize that you have to make it available to the public to come and comment on if they liked it or not.
I think the intent's there, though, at least you're notifying, saying this is what's going to be on the agenda for this property. So if you're a neighbor that's influenced, or this influences your property.
Sure.
Okay, well, maybe I want to pay attention to that meeting.
Right, no, I get it, that's good. Thanks.
All right, well, nice to meet you all.
So we should.
If particular things arise, feel free to contact.
Present case to all the.
Yeah, I'm going to adjourn this meeting at 6:40 on April 18th.
That was the hearing.
Now, don't everybody just go out and have beers and talk
Yeah.
about it.
Hey, Bill, you want to talk about